Death loomed large in Victorian Britain. Cholera, tuberculosis, and industrial accidents claimed lives daily, and high infant mortality rates were a constant shadow. But in the midst of poverty and hardship, a profound story of resilience, love, and mourning unfolds. This is the untold history of how the working class faced death, not with indifference, but with care, symbolism, and an unrelenting desire to uphold dignity. Victorian Britain was a time of immense inequality. While the wealthy displayed their grief through opulent funerals, the poor faced an entirely different reality. Death often came suddenly and cruelly. Infectious diseases like cholera and typhus tore through overcrowded slums, taking lives indiscriminately. For many families, mourning rituals were not a luxury but a necessity deeply embedded in their cultural identity. Death was not a stranger in these homes, writes Julie Marie Strange in her book Death, Grief and Poverty in Britain. It was an ever-present reality, and mourning became a way to reaffirm the dignity of those who had so little in life. Mortality rates in Victorian and Edwardian Britain reflected the harsh realities of life for the working class. Infant mortality was especially devastating, with as many as 1 in 5 children in urban areas dying before their 5th birthday. Common causes of death included diseases like pulmonary tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, smallpox, measles, and diphtheria, which thrived in overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions. Overcrowding was a persistent issue. In 1891, nearly 19% of Londoners and 10% of Liverpool's population lived with 2 or more people in a single room. These grim statistics underscore the constant presence of death and disease in the lives of the urban poor, shaping their mourning practices and cultural responses to loss. For the working class, mourning began in the home. The preparation of the body, washing, dressing, and laying it out, was a final act of love and intimacy. This act of care was not just practical, it was deeply symbolic. It allowed families to say goodbye in their own way, even when public rituals were inaccessible due to poverty. In one harrowing account, a family in Liverpool lived in the same room as the body of their loved one for several days. The space was too small to move the deceased, yet this proximity became a way of preserving their presence in those final days. But this closeness also presented challenges. Overcrowded homes meant that the living and the dead often shared the same, small, suffocating spaces with little regard for hygiene. Public health officials saw these practices as threats to community health, creating tensions between tradition and reform. One of the most fascinating aspects of Victorian working-class mourning was the rise of burial clubs. These were early forms of insurance where families paid small weekly contributions to ensure they could afford a proper funeral. For many, the funeral was the ultimate expression of respectability, a final opportunity to honor the deceased. Take the case of a Bolton family that saved for years to afford a respectable burial for their mother. Despite having little else, the funeral became their way of affirming her value and dignity. But these clubs weren't without controversy. Some suspected parents of insuring their children's lives only to neglect their care. While these accusations were largely unfounded, they highlight the social anxieties surrounding poverty and death. The cemetery was more than a resting place. It was a landscape of grief, memory, and even resistance. Poor families often visited graves to reaffirm connections with the deceased. For many, these visits were deeply personal, contrasting with the public displays of wealth seen in grand Victorian funerals. In one poignant case from Liverpool, a mother returned to her child's grave weekly, bringing flowers she could scarcely afford. These acts of remembrance, while quiet, were powerful assertions of love and defiance against a society that devalued their grief. Perhaps the most heartrending aspect of mourning in poverty was grieving for children. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Nearly 1 in 5 children in urban areas died before their 5th birthday, yet these losses were deeply felt. Families used symbols, keepsakes, and rituals to commemorate these brief lives. Julie Marie Strange recounts how working-class families often kept locks of hair, tiny shoes, or handmade toys as mementos. These objects became sacred, tangible reminders of their children. While public narratives often portrayed these families as hardened by loss, the reality was far more complex. Their grief, though understated, was profound and enduring. The working-class experience of mourning was filled with contradictions. On one hand, poverty forced families to improvise and adapt their rituals. On the other, they went to great lengths to provide a respectable funeral, even at the cost of going into debt. The pauper's grave, a dreaded fate, symbolized ultimate shame. In George Gissing's novel The Netherworld, a character's rage at having to bury his wife in a pauper's grave speaks to the deep cultural significance of a proper burial. "She's had nothing but pain and poverty all her life," he laments, "and now they'll pitch her out of the way in a parish box." The story of mourning in Victorian Britain is one of resilience. It reminds us that grief transcends wealth and status. Even in the most challenging circumstances, people found ways to honor their loved ones and express their sorrow. Let us know in the comments, how do you think grief and mourning have evolved over time? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that bring history to life.